Almost everything we still live with today began as a bad medieval night, a problem that refused to wait until morning, a decision made quickly, quietly, and without much confidence. And once it worked, even accidentally, it never really went away. Hey guys, tonight is one of those stories that doesn't ask much of you. You don't need to follow every sentence. You don't need to remember where we started. Just let the words move along at their own pace, like footsteps echoing down a stone corridor that never quite ends. Medieval Europe was not built for comfort. It was built for endurance. Cold rooms, flickering light, people wrapped in wool, arguing about things they barely understood, while knowing that whatever they decided might cause a riot by sunrise. Most systems weren't invented with ambition. They were invented with relief. The medieval mind was always dealing with emergencies. Not dramatic ones, just constant pressure. Too many people, not enough food, messages arriving late, fires spreading too fast, crowds growing restless. And every time something broke, someone somewhere had to patch it quickly. Those patches became habits. Let's begin with something simple. Order. Medieval towns were loud, confusing places. Everyone moved when they felt like it. Markets opened whenever sellers arrived. Meetings started when enough people showed up. And this worked fine, until it didn't. Then came moments when timing mattered. Gates needed closing before trouble wandered in. Prayers needed synchronizing. Workers needed to stop arguing about when work actually began. So, bells were introduced. Not ceremonially, practically. Ring the bell. Something happens. At first, it was just a signal. But people listened. They adjusted. And slowly, time stopped belonging to individuals. It belonged to the bell. The emergency passed. The bell stayed. And suddenly, daily life revolved around external signals instead of instinct. Now drift over to memory. Or rather, the failure of it. Medieval governance relied heavily on people remembering things correctly. Who owed what? Who owned which land? Who promised whom something years ago? And this worked fine until someone forgot, or lied, or died inconveniently. So, writing appeared as a solution to arguments, not to preserve history, to stop shouting. Charters were drawn, lists were made, copies stored, not because anyone trusted paper more than people, but because paper didn't talk back. Once something was written, it felt real, final, harder to challenge. And just like that, written records replaced flexible agreements. The emergency ended, bureaucracy began. Let's slide gently into authority. Medieval rulers were constantly worried about losing control. Not philosophically, practically. Control meant stability. Stability meant fewer fires, fewer riots, fewer heads rolling in public squares. So power centralized during crises. One voice, one command, decisions made quickly. And when those moments passed, the structure remained. Decentralizing felt risky. Letting go felt dangerous. So authority stayed concentrated, defended not as convenience, but as necessity. Now, think about rules. Medieval rules were often reactive. Someone cheated at a market. New rule. Someone insulted the wrong person. New rule. Someone exploited a loophole. Another rule. The law wasn't a code. It was a growing list of things people were tired of dealing with. Over time, the list grew heavy, complicated, sacred, and questioning it became suspicious. Because rules meant order, and order meant survival. Even clothing was affected. Dress codes didn't exist for beauty. They existed for clarity. In emergencies, you needed to know who someone was at a glance. Noble, cleric, worker, outsider. Fabric and color became identity markers. Those distinctions hardened, passed down, justified. And centuries later, we still signal status through clothing, pretending it's fashion rather than fear. Let's slow down and talk about silence. Silence mattered in medieval life. Loudness meant unrest. Quiet meant control, so silence was enforced. at night during prayer, in certain spaces, not for peace, for predictability. That idea survived. Quiet hours, restricted noise, the subtle assumption that silence is civilized. Another emergency habit, still whispering rules into modern life. And all of this shared the same origin. None of it was planned. None of it was elegant. It was people doing what worked once, then doing it again, because changing it felt like inviting chaos back in. The medieval world didn't design the future. It accidentally trapped it. So as we continue drifting through these stories, keep that in mind. Every system will pass was once just a tired person saying, "This will do for now." And somehow, it always did. And once that phrase settles in your mind, "This will do for now," it starts echoing everywhere you look in medieval history. It becomes the quiet background noise behind almost every institution that survived the era. Not intention, not vision, just a deep desire for things to stop getting worse. Let's drift a little further into the everyday chaos of medieval towns. Streets were narrow, uneven, and constantly busy. Animals wandered freely. Waste went wherever gravity allowed. People argued loudly because there was no real expectation of privacy. This worked, in a loose way, until emergencies forced intervention. A fire would break out, or a disease would spread, or a fight would turn into a riot. And suddenly, movement mattered. Crowds needed controlling. So barriers appeared. Gates, checkpoints, guards. Not as symbols of oppression, but as blunt tools to slow things down. Once movement could be controlled in a crisis, it became tempting to control it all the time. Who entered? Who left? When? Why? Temporary restrictions quietly became normal boundaries, and the idea that freedom of movement required permission slipped gently into daily life. Now, let's wander into trust, or rather, the lack of it. Medieval society did not trust easily. Too many people disappeared. Too many promises evaporated. Too many officials abused whatever authority they were given. So verification became important. Witnesses, seals, oaths, multiple confirmations for a single action. At first, this was just a way to prevent fraud during disputes. But redundancy feels reassuring, especially to people who have seen things go wrong often. So, systems multiplied. One check became two, two became three. And eventually, the process mattered more than the result. If the steps were followed, the outcome was accepted, even if it was wrong. That mindset never left. Now consider punishment again, but from a quieter angle. Medieval justice wasn't always about guilt. It was about restoring balance, making an example, calming nerves. If people felt something had been done, even poorly, unrest eased. So penalties were standardized, predictable, flat. Not because they were just, but because predictability reduced anger. People could brace themselves, and predictability feels safer than fairness when fear is high. This logic hardened into legal codes that still value consistency over compassion. Another emergency preference disguised as principle. Let's slow down even more and talk about waiting. Medieval life involved a lot of it. Waiting for orders, waiting for messages, waiting for approval, waiting for weather. And waiting became structured. Lines formed, turn-taking emerged, priority lists developed. These weren't polite inventions. They were crowd control mechanisms, ways to stop people from pushing, shouting, or panicking when resources were scarce. Over time, waiting became a moral behavior. Impatience became a flaw. Compliance became virtue. We still queue. We still wait. We still accept delay as normal. A medieval coping mechanism turned into social etiquette. Now drift toward fear of change itself. Medieval people lived close to disaster. Change often meant disruption. Disruption meant danger. So stability became sacred. Tradition became armor. The older something was, the safer it felt. Even when a system no longer worked well, Altering it felt riskier than tolerating its flaws, because flaws were familiar, and familiarity is comforting when survival feels uncertain. This is why so many medieval systems lingered long after their usefulness faded, not because they were effective, but because they were known. Let's gently move into record keeping again, but this time emotionally. Writing things down didn't just preserve information, it transferred responsibility. If something went wrong, the document could be blamed. The rule, the order, the precedent. This was a relief. Decisions stopped feeling personal. They became procedural. And people love procedures because procedures don't argue back. They don't feel guilt. They don't change their minds. That emotional detachment still lives inside modern systems. The comfort of saying, that's just how it's done. And perhaps the most subtle inheritance of all was resignation. Medieval people learned to live inside systems they didn't design and couldn't escape. Complaining too loudly was dangerous. Resisting was exhausting. Adapting was safer. So adaptation became wisdom. Endurance became virtue. And accepting flawed structures became a survival skill passed quietly from generation to generation. As we keep moving through this story, nothing dramatic needs to happen. No turning point arrives. Because the medieval world didn't turn sharply. It drifted, slowly, heavily, like a ship adjusting course, one anxious decision at a time. And every time someone said, we'll fix it properly later, later never quite arrived. So we continue onward. Through more rooms lit by tired candles, more tables covered in parchment, more rules born from bad nights and worse mornings, and the systems keep forming, calmly, relentlessly, waiting for us to inherit them. And once you accept that later rarely arrived, the medieval world starts to feel less distant, not because the clothes or buildings resemble ours, but because the mindset does. The constant balancing act between effort and exhaustion, between fixing something properly and just fixing it enough. Let's drift into the idea of responsibility. Medieval authority figures were often overwhelmed. A lord, a bishop, a mayor, none of them had the tools to manage everything directly. So responsibility was pushed downward. Guilds regulated themselves. Villages handled their own disputes. Families disciplined their own members. This wasn't empowerment. It was delegation born of fatigue. Central authority simply couldn't keep up. But once people became used to policing themselves, the arrangement stuck. It felt efficient, and it felt natural. Even today, institutions quietly rely on the same logic. Someone higher up assumes someone lower down will handle it. And most of the time, they do. Now, let's gently wander into fear of strangers. Medieval life was intensely local. Most people never traveled far. Outsiders meant unpredictability, disease, crime, trouble. So identification became important. Where are you from? Who sent you? Why are you here? Papers appeared. Letters of passage, seals, references, not to welcome newcomers, but to contain risk. And the habit of asking for proof followed travelers everywhere. Eventually, identity itself became something you carried, rather than something assumed. That emergency instinct still shapes how we move through the world. Checkpoints, documents, verification. All rooted in the simple medieval fear of not knowing who someone is. Let's slow down and consider work. Medieval labor wasn't scheduled for productivity. It was scheduled for survival. You worked when there was light. You stopped when there wasn't. But emergencies disrupted this rhythm. Harvests needed protection. Supplies needed moving. Repairs needed finishing before storms arrived. So, work hours were enforced. Breaks regulated. Absences punished. Not because anyone loved discipline, but because unfinished work during a crisis had consequences. Over time, the crisis faded. The discipline stayed. And work became something you owed time to rather than effort. Now drift into the strange relationship medieval people had with mistakes. Errors were dangerous. A miscopied word could alter a contract. A misheard instruction could start a fight. So caution was prized. Double-checking became habit. Hesitation became wisdom. Innovation slowed. Not because people lacked creativity, but because mistakes cost too much. This created cultures where tradition felt safer than experimentation, and that preference for caution embedded itself deeply into institutions that still resist change today. Let's gently talk about charity. Medieval charity wasn't primarily about kindness. It was about stability. Hungry people were unpredictable. Desperate people were dangerous. So alms were given, not evenly, not generously, just enough. This created systems. Rules about who deserved help, when, how much. Charity became regulated, controlled, and the idea that aid should be conditional grew from fear, not morality. A medieval attempt to keep desperation quiet still echoes in modern welfare debates. Now drift toward ceremonies. Medieval people loved ritual, not because it was beautiful, but because it slowed things down. Coronations, trials, meetings, every important action wrapped in procedure. Ritual prevented impulsive decisions. It created pauses, time to cool tempers, time to gather witnesses, time to reconsider. What began as a break on chaos became tradition, and tradition became authority itself. Even grief was structured. Mourning periods, dress codes, public displays. Not to honor the dead, but to manage the living, to keep emotions predictable, contained, acceptable. As we move further along, you can feel how deeply these habits settled, how they shaped not just systems, but personalities. People learned when to speak, when to wait, when to obey, when to endure, and endurance became the defining skill of medieval life. Not courage, not brilliance, just the ability to keep going inside imperfect systems without demanding they make sense. And maybe that's why so many medieval fixes survived, because they didn't promise happiness. They promised continuity. Another day, another night survived, another problem delayed. So we keep drifting past more rules, more routines, more quiet compromises that traded freedom for predictability, flexibility for safety. And somewhere along the way, those compromises stopped feeling temporary. They became normal. And with that weight settling gently, like dust on old vellum, we continue onward, through a world built not by design, but by people who were very, very tired. And when everything starts to feel normal, that's when the system really takes hold. Not through force, not through fear, but through habit. Medieval people didn't wake up thinking they lived inside rigid structures. They woke up thinking this was just how life worked. Let's drift into obedience. Medieval obedience wasn't ideological. It wasn't loyalty to abstract ideas like the state or the nation. It was practical. Disobedience caused delays. Delays caused attention. Attention caused trouble. So compliance became the quiet path of least resistance. Over time, obedience stopped feeling like something you did and started feeling like something you were. A good subject, a good parishioner, a good member of the town. These weren't moral categories at first. They were survival strategies that eventually grew personalities around themselves. Now consider how information flowed. Medieval people didn't expect to know much. News traveled slowly, often inaccurately. Rumors filled gaps. This created anxiety during emergencies. Panic spread faster than truth. So authorities controlled messaging. Announcements, declarations, official voices. Once people learned to wait for the real version of events, curiosity dulled. Passive listening became normal, and the habit of deferring understanding to authority settled in quietly. Another emergency behavior, still alive. Let's slow down even more and talk about space. Medieval spaces were controlled carefully. Who could enter where? Who could sit where? Who stood? Who waited? These arrangements weren't about comfort. They were about preventing conflict. Spatial hierarchy reduced friction. Churches, courts, halls. Everything arranged to signal order instantly. You didn't need explanations. You could see where you belonged. And once people learned to read space this way, it followed them everywhere. Even now, rooms still tell us how to behave before anyone speaks. Now drift toward patience. Medieval patience wasn't praised because it was virtuous. It was praised because impatience caused problems. Fights, disruptions, punishments. So, patience became a learned behavior. Rewarded, encouraged, romanticized. But patience often meant acceptance. Enduring delays, enduring unfairness, enduring silence. And that acceptance was incredibly useful to systems that needed people to wait quietly while nothing changed. Let's gently consider shame. Medieval societies used shame efficiently. Public correction, visible penalties. Reputation mattered because privacy barely existed. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was cost-effective control. Shame required no guards, no paperwork, no infrastructure, just witnesses. And the habit of internalizing rules to avoid embarrassment became deeply ingrained. Even today, shame remains one of the most powerful tools systems use without admitting they're using it. Now drift into scarcity. Medieval life was defined by it. Scarcity of food, time, safety, options. Scarcity trains the mind to cling to what works, even when it hurts, to distrust change, to fear loss more than stagnation. This mindset hardened systems. Once something existed, removing it felt like risking collapse. So systems grew layered, complex, inefficient, but familiar, and familiarity felt safer than improvement. Let's slow down and look at repetition. Medieval rituals repeated endlessly, daily prayers, seasonal festivals, annual obligations. Repetition calmed nerves. It made time feel structured, predictable. Repetition also discouraged questioning. If something happens often enough, it stops feeling optional, and eventually, it stops being noticed at all. That's how emergency fixes disappear into background noise. And somewhere in all of this, people stopped seeing systems as human-made. They began seeing them as natural, like weather, like aging, like night following day. The idea that things could be different faded quietly. That's when a temporary solution becomes permanent, not because it's defended aggressively, but because no one remembers how to imagine life without it. And so the medieval world carried on, slowly, carefully, enduring, passing down not just land and titles, but habits of compliance, caution, patience, and quiet acceptance. As we continue drifting through this long, dim corridor of history, nothing dramatic changes. No revolution interrupts the flow. Just more days lived inside structures that once promised safety and eventually became invisible. And maybe that's the most medieval thing of all. To survive long enough inside a system that you forget it was ever meant to be temporary. So we move on, still floating, still listening to the soft echo of tired decisions repeating themselves century after century. And once systems become invisible, they stop feeling negotiable. Medieval people didn't argue with the structure of life very often, not because they loved it, but because arguing required energy, and energy was always in short supply. Let's drift gently into the idea of permission. In early medieval life, people did many things instinctively. You moved when you needed to, you built when you could, you traded when opportunity appeared. But emergencies changed that. Uncoordinated action during a crisis made things worse. Fires spread, crowds panicked, supplies vanished. So permission became necessary. Not philosophically, logistically. Someone needed to approve action so they didn't collide with someone else's panic. And once permission existed, withholding it became power. Slowly, the idea that you should ask first crept into everyday behavior, even when the emergency was long gone. Now consider slowness. Medieval systems moved slowly on purpose. Speed caused mistakes. Mistakes caused blame, so delays were built in. Waiting periods, cooling off times, multiple steps, layers of review. This wasn't inefficiency. It was risk management. Slowness reduced impulsive damage, and eventually, slowness felt respectable. Rushed action felt suspicious. That preference still lingers. We often trust slow processes more than fast ones, even when speed would help. Let's slow down even further and talk about hierarchy inside families. Medieval households were strict, not because parents enjoyed control, but because chaos inside the home spilled outward. Disobedient children meant unpredictable adults. So, authority started early. Clear rules, clear consequences. Those structures trained people to accept hierarchy before they ever encountered formal institutions. Obedience felt familiar, natural, comfortable, even. Another emergency containment strategy turned lifelong habit. Now drift toward language again, but this time tone. Medieval speech was careful, respectful. Titles mattered. Forms of address mattered. Speaking out of turn caused offense. Offense caused trouble. So language became layered. Polite forms, deferential phrases, indirect criticism, all designed to reduce friction in crowded, tense environments. And once those patterns settled in, speaking plainly felt rude, even dangerous. Let's gently look at conflict avoidance. Medieval people were not peaceful, but they learned to delay conflict, to redirect it, to bury it under procedure. Because open conflict was expensive, this created a culture of quiet resentment. Problems postponed rather than resolved. Grievances recorded rather than addressed. Another habit we know very well today. Now, consider how medieval people understood responsibility for outcomes. If something went wrong, blame rarely landed on the system. It landed on individuals. Someone failed to follow the rule. Someone disobeyed. Someone was careless. This protected the structure. Systems survive by framing failure as personal error rather than design flaw. And that habit of blaming users instead of systems never really disappeared. Let's drift into the relationship between fear and repetition again. When people are afraid, they repeat what worked last time, even if the context has changed, even if the results are diminishing. Medieval people lived in near constant low-level fear. Not terror, just unease. And repetition soothed that unease. Familiar rules, familiar rhythms, familiar burdens. Change meant uncertainty. Uncertainty felt dangerous. So continuity was chosen again and again, until it felt like destiny rather than preference. Now, slow down and notice how all of this shaped identity. Medieval people didn't think of themselves as individuals in the modern sense. They were roles, positions, functions, inside systems. And systems like that don't need enthusiastic participants. They just need people who know where to stand and when to speak. As we drift onward, the night feels long. The candle burns lower. Another rule is written. Another habit formed. Another emergency quietly resolves itself without ever fully ending. And generations later, someone inherits that rule and assumes it has always existed. They don't see the panic behind it. They don't hear the tired voices arguing late into the night. They just live inside the result. And so the medieval world carries forward, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, teaching us, without meaning to, how quickly survival choices can become traditions, and how easily traditions become invisible. We'll keep drifting. There's no rush. History isn't going anywhere. And so the days keep passing, quietly, one after another. In the medieval world, nothing really happens anymore, not in a way that feels new. Everything feels settled, even when it isn't working very well. People wake up knowing what is expected of them. They follow rules they didn't create. They respect authorities they've never met. They wait for bells, papers, permissions, and signs, not because they believe deeply in them, but because they've learned that resistance costs more energy than compliance. At some point, even emergencies stop feeling urgent. They become background noise. Another shortage, another dispute, another announcement. Handled with the same tools as last time, and the time before that, and the time before that. The medieval mind adapts to this rhythm. Life isn't about improvement. It's about continuity, about making it through winter, about keeping things from falling apart too quickly. The systems that exist might be flawed, but they're familiar, and familiarity is its own form of comfort. Even frustration becomes routine. People complain softly, privately, in ways that don't disrupt the order of things. Complaints that never quite turn into demands. Demands that never quite turn into change. And over generations, the origin of the systems fades. No one remembers why the bell rings at that hour, or why the rule exists in that form, or why permission is needed for something that seems harmless. They just know that it does. Children grow up inside these structures. They learn them before they learn to question. They absorb habits of waiting, obeying, adapting. By the time they're old enough to notice the constraints feel like gravity, not imposed, just there. And so the medieval world doesn't collapse under the weight of its systems. It stabilizes, slowly, unevenly, like a wall built from mismatched stones that somehow keeps standing because no one dares remove any single piece. Occasionally, someone does question it all. Someone wonders aloud why things must be this way. But questioning feels abstract, distant. Daily life demands attention. Crops, work, weather. Survival leaves little room for reimagining the structure underneath everything. So the questions fade. The routines remain. And then, without ceremony, centuries pass. The buildings change. The clothes change. The tools improve. But the underlying habits stay remarkably familiar. Rules created in panic are defended as tradition. Procedures invented for emergencies are treated as timeless wisdom. The tired decisions of medieval knights continue doing their quiet work. No one notices them anymore. And maybe that's the final shape of all emergency fixes. They don't announce themselves as permanent. They don't demand loyalty. They simply wait long enough to be forgotten. So as this long story finally slows to a stop, there's nothing left to uncover. No final revelation. Just the soft understanding that much of the world we live in wasn't designed with care or foresight. It was assembled slowly, by people trying to get through difficult moments without making things worse. And somehow, that was enough. The candle burns low. The room grows quieter. The bell has already rung. There's nothing more to fix tonight.